Hello and welcome. This video is for practicing cases, looking at John chapter 1 and thinking about how we spot which noun is in the nominative, which is accusative, which is dative, and which is genitive. This is an important part of working out the meaning of a sentence in Koine Greek. This is just going to cover a few verses in the first chapter of John to help you to practice identifying those in English. So, using just the English as I said, we're going to look at firstly 1 John 6. I want you to think about which noun is genitive, which is accusative, and which is dative. Also, look at the sentence and think which verb is used twice. That's important because it's actually the main verb in this case. You might not think so, but it is. And also I'm going to mention briefly which is the participle. Participles we will come to later. They're quite difficult. We'll do that intermediate level Greek, but I want you to understand the principle behind them in English first. At each point that I've asked a question in this video, you may want to hit the pause button if you need some more time to think about it. I'll move on fairly quickly with just quite short pauses between what I say. So be ready with that pause button if you need extra time to think. So on that first question, the man, which is John the Baptist, is in the nominative. God is in the genitive. And the name, John, not the actual person, but just the noun that is his name, John, is in the dative. So firstly, the nominative, remember, is the main subject doing the primary verb. And the verb, as I said, look out for it because it's mentioned twice. The main verb here is not sent, but the verb to be, was in this case because it's past tense. So the man was. That's the nominative and the verb. The genitive, remember, is about either possession or association. Now the man is from God. So in a sense, God is possessive of him. He is a man of God. And God is our Father, as it also says in this chapter of John. So that's consistent with the theology of John, that John has written this with God in the genitive in this case. Now the dative is called the dative because it is the indirect object, and that is John. Not John himself, but the word. His name here is John. Now the actual word name in the Greek, you've got a semicolon after God, and name is a new nominative, another nominative. But John here is in the dative because it's his name and it's an additional noun in the sentence that isn't doing a verb but is the object of one. Another object of one, so he's dative. So next, let's look at verse 7. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. For starters, I just want to look at the first clause of this bit. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light. Can you spot in this part, just in that first clause, the noun or nouns that are in the nominative case? Again, pause the video if you need a little bit more time to think about it. Well done if you got the answer correct. The nominatives are both the pronoun he and the noun light. So why is that the case? Well, the word he and the word light are both subjects of this verb, not objects of it. To be an accusative, the second noun would have to be the object of the verb being done by the nominative. The verb here is testify. And he is not doing the testimony to the light. He is not doing something to an object. So that light is in an equal position in a grammatical sense in the order of the sentence. It's equal in terms of the verb. That the verb preceding it, testify. So, can you spot the noun or nouns that are in the nominative case in the next clause? Again, pause the video if you need to have a think. So in the second clause within John chapter 1 verse 7, we have so that through him all might believe. Now the pronoun him is a genitive because it's in possession of something. So you might ask, what is it in possession of? It is in possession of the witness testimony. Now that is a participle up there, but remember it can act like a noun, like an object. So that's what he is in possession of. And so John is in the genitive. We know who it is, so we're not repeating his name, we're just using the pronoun him, and he possesses the testimony. Then you've got a new nominative, all. And that's because there's another verb, the verb to believe. So something is happening in order that all might believe. And where we have something that says in order that or so that, that's called a subjunctive. So this is a subjunctive verb here, because something needs to happen in order that something happens. That's the subjunctive mood. So all is nominative, and the verb associated with it is believe. Now, as I mentioned, there is a verb called a subjunctive verb in there. So the subjunctive is a verb where a wish or a suggestion is in the sentence, so that something you want to happen is going to happen in order that it might happen, so that it may happen. Here's the Collins Dictionary definition in English. A clause expressing a wish or suggestion can be put into the subjunctive or in the subjunctive mood by using the base form of a verb like were. Example, she asked that they be removed. I wish I were somewhere else. These structures are formal. These are several examples of the subjunctive. Very often when it's translated from the New Testament, we use phrases like in order that, or so it might, or so they may. An example is that Jesus was crucified so that we might be saved from our sins. And in that case, the saved bit is it's past tense, but it's a subjunctive because something's happened in order that. And we usually get it with either a word an or hina, which shows that that is going to happen, so that's something else to look out for. But we'll come back to that when we do verbs. And by the way, as I said, that word witness is a participle. There are lots and lots of participles in the New Testament, even more than we get in English. Remember that these are a noun that acts like an adjective but has a verbal form. They can act in place of a noun, as it has in this case. So when you're translating them, try to have all three of those things in mind. They're often quite complex and often quite difficult to convey them back in English, and we'll come back to these at an intermediate level after we've done all the nouns and all the verb forms. But I just want to notice it here because it's a very good example. Witness looks like a noun, but in the original text it's clear that it's a participle, and literal translations have this as he came in order that he might bear witness. It's quite difficult to convey that in English. So it's one of those things that we can show a little bit more by understanding Greek. There's a little bit more detail in there in Greek than we can easily convey in English. And that's where it's useful to have that extra bit of knowledge that you will gain from learning about this language. So let's also just give a bit of explanation about what the participle is. Remember, today I'm just going to be looking at the English grammar here. We're not going to be learning some Greek here. I want you to understand it from an English point of view. A participle is a noun. Here it is according to the Merriam-Webster website. It has the characteristics of both a verb and an adjective. It's much the same way in Greek as it is in the definition that is being put before you here. For now, just be aware that participles exist, because this is a bit more complicated and it'll be a later stage that we come back to them. We need to do nouns, and we need to cover adjectives, and we need to cover verbs before we've built the knowledge to use participles. There's a lot of prerequisite knowledge in there. But just be aware that they are there and they happen quite a lot. We can learn a lot from these and from the form that the word takes. In linguists talk about the term morphology. That's the technical way that they talk about the form of a word. And the morphology of a participle is often very significant in translating sentences. So keep in mind that they are there, but for now let's move on and continue to look at 1 John as we work out how to do case. Something else that's going to be relevant for when we study participles, by the way. So in verse 8, have a little look at this. What case or cases are the pronoun he and the noun light in? And well done if you worked that out. They are both nominatives. These are both nominatives because there's not a verb that the first nominative is doing to the second nominative. And so they kind of are taking an equal position in the sentence. One is not the object of the action of the other. And that's the crucial thing when understanding nominative and accusative, or nominative, accusative and dative. Right, so he, John, is not doing something to the light. The verb here is not. Again, was not, sorry. Again, the verb to be, it's got the negative not with it. So he was not. So the verb to be, was, is being done by the nominative pronoun he, but it's not being done to the light. So the light is not the object that the verb is acting upon, so it's also going to be a nominative, another noun stated in the sentence. Then, in the second clause of verse 8, we're going to have the word light coming back again, but this time as a genitive. Now just on that, please remember that verses were put into the Bible, chapters and verses were put in hundreds of years later by a guy called Stephen Langton. He was Archbishop of Canterbury, and towards the end of the 13th century, and this was really considered controversial at the time. Some people thought he was doing a terrible thing by doing this, but he put in the verses and the chapters into the Bible, and thank the Lord, literally, that he did. He is buried in Canterbury Cathedral, and you can actually visit his tomb there and find out more about that. But when you are translating Koine Greek, remember they were not written with chapters and verses. What you need to pay attention to is things like sentences, half sentences, breaks in the sentence, clauses, paragraphs, speech marks, things like that that were in the original text. It's a bit like when you read your Bible, you might get a subheading for each little section. Again, they are added in by the Bible translator to describe what's coming next. They're not actually part of the biblical text. Okay, so now why is light in the genitive? Now you may remember genitive is about either being in a possessive sense, owning something, or it is associative. It associates with something. Now in this case, the light is associated with the witness testimony. So we've heard about John, he being the pronoun and the nominative here, he came. And it says only as a witness to the light. So light is associated with the word witness. And that's why it is in the genitive case here. Where in the first part of that sentence, it was in the nominative. Now let me just read that out for you so you can hear a little bit of it. Uk ein ekeidos tophos, alhina matu rese peri to photos. So we've got, as I mentioned, hina in there, which is a conjunction. You can see the conj underneath, it stands for conjunction. And then you've got on the right hand side a word translated as he might bear witness, ma tu re se. Well, that is a subjunctive verb. So he came in order that he might do something. So again, there's that subjunctive example there for you. Now let's move on. But before we do, I just want to warn you that there is such a thing as third declension nouns. I'm going to be putting up a video about third declension nouns, but if you have just seen the video on first and second declension nouns, be warned that there's a new set with different endings to them. You don't really need to worry about that too much at the moment, because what we're doing today is just thinking about the theory that goes behind the grammatical structure in Greek. We will come on to learning actually what the endings are. What's important is, firstly, that you know that it's a noun, and secondly, knowing things like its case, its number, and its gender. It doesn't actually matter which way it declines, and by looking at software, apps, websites that tell you that it's a noun, it really doesn't matter too much if you've memorized all those large charts for 3 different declensions of nouns. But just be aware that there are a group of nouns, and within that group there are several subgroups that they're kind of irregular in a sense, but they've come to form their own rules within their own context, so there is a pattern to them. So they're not completely irregular, there is some pattern there, but they're a little bit different and a little less common, but they're certainly around enough that we need to be aware of them, and we're coming up to one now. John is used because it's a really good book to teach from, but unfortunately it's thrown in for us some participles and third declension nouns quite early on, and that's something that we're going to come back to. Uk ein ekeinos tophos, alhina martu rese peri tu photos. So, as I said, we're still in verse 8 here. We've got starting out an adversative word, not. Then the verb to be, which in the past tense means was. So we would shift those when we want to get the sentence to make sense in English. We would shift those after the pronoun ekeinos here, meaning he. So we would say he was not the light, but he came that he might bear witness concerning the light. Now right at the end of the sentence, you've got the word for light is photos, and Bible Hub, where I got this text from, gives you above the word the phonetic pronunciation, and yes, that word phonetic comes from photos in Greek. Photos means light, in particular the sort of light that illuminates things like firelight does, for example. And it is actually one of those third declension nouns, although it's a very, very regular one, of course, in the Bible. So the tos bit on the end, photos, would usually tell us that it's a masculine noun in the nominative case. But look below where it says light, you'll see N, that's noun, we know it's a noun. The next is a G for genitive. Because it's a third declension noun, if it ends in os, it's actually going to be genitive. The next letter after that G is another N, which means it's neuter, so it's not masculine at all. And then the S means singular. Light here is a concept, of course. So although it's used in the singular, the word is meaning in general the concept of light, of the illuminating light. And we start to see this term, photos, or phoatos as it used to be in ancient Greek, starts popping up around 800 years BC. And this concept of light and darkness is very common in thinking about good and evil and truthfulness and things like that. John keeps using it here. Above you can see it is in a slightly different form as phos, the light on the top line there, phos. And that again is a noun as it says, but it is nominative, neuter and singular. So we've got N, 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 S on Bible Hub. Just run your cursor over those letters on Bible Hub and it will come up and say noun, nominative, neuter, singular. And remember, parsing is really important in understanding sentences. Next in the sentence, it's worth pointing out that the verb hasn't been stated again. It's already been stated. That's something that happens quite a bit in Greek. So sometimes you just need to look back for what it is, but it's obviously implied by the context here. And at the end of the sentence, as I just said, we've got photos. Can you remember why we know it's genitive? You see it says N-G and S. You know it's genitive because it has the definite article beforehand, to, with that omicron upsilon and a circumflex over it. So although it's a third declension noun with a different set of endings, the definite article stays the same and reminds us that it is genitive. On Bible Hub, it tells you at the bottom, it just gives you letters for what the parsing is. It says art, that's short for definite article, and the definite article will always agree with the noun that it goes with. It's usually translated as the. Sometimes you get some other translations, but usually is the. And that also, therefore, is genitive, neuter, and singular. So next, we've got 1 John 9. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. Have a look for a nominative and 2 accusatives here and consider why those 2 accusatives are both accusative, not accusative and dative. So here it is with the Greek interlinear text for you here. We've got the light, the true one. That's the nominative. And it's talking about Jesus, of course, who enlightens every man. So man, as in mankind, as in humanity, anthropon, is being enlightened. They are the object the verb is acting towards. So the true one, Jesus, is enlightening the man, the object. Now why is it, therefore, that at the end of the sentence the word kosmon, meaning world, is also accusative? Well, that's because that nominative, Jesus, is doing another verb, coming, komenon, coming into the world. And world is therefore the object of a verb being done by the nominative. So both the man, as in mankind, and the world have a verb acting towards them. They are the object of the verbs, and they're being done by Jesus, who is the light, who is the true one that this sentence is talking about. Now in John 1 verse 10, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. I'm using NIV translations here, by the way. It's not quite literal, but the NIV does have pretty good word equivalence whilst giving you sentences with a word order that makes sense in English. So that's why I'm using it here. So in the Greek, the word order says, in the world he was. It makes more sense to say in English, he was in the world. The next clause, and the world through him came into being. Again, we'd change that order and say, and the world came into being through him. Well, in that case, the world has gone into the nominative because it is doing a verb, agenitor, coming into being. Now, if you see in the word agenitor, you've got gen. It's got an epsilon at the start because it's in the past tense, and that's what happens when verbs go into the past tense in the indicative mood. They have an e on the beginning. But gen is as in Genesis, a word that comes back in quite a lot of forms: agenemetha, agenitor, ginomai, geneste, all sorts of different forms of that word. But it's quite important, the one about coming into being. It's what we get genesis or genetics from. And remember, it's a hard j sound, not a j or j, like jump or giant, but g sound hard, g, egeneto. As we move on to our last clause, kai ho cosmos auton uk egno, and the world, him, did not know, or knew him not. Again, the word order in Greek doesn't make sense in English, but the syntax, which means the way that the words are laid out, in Greek doesn't matter as much as it does in English. In English, we convey a great deal of meaning by putting words into a certain order, and it makes the speed that we can say things at, it just makes it smoother and easier to convey meaning. But then if we write down an email or something, things can be lost, like tone can be lost. Things that we might want to convey can be lost when we're writing it down because we're not putting the inflection, the tone in our voice and stuff like that. So there are advantages to the complexities of Greek. Now the morphology of the word, that means the form that it is in, tells us the part of the sentence it's in. Now in English, the part of the sentence is determined by word order, but in Greek it is the morphology, the form, and not the syntax, which means the layout. So when you're translating this into English, you wouldn't put the word knew, K-N-E-W, knew, at the end of that sentence. You would probably translate that as something like, and the world did not know him. In the 11th verse we read, he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. So he came, the verb to come here is used in the third person singular, so we know it's a he doing it, and we know in the context of the paragraph of this Jesus is being talked about. He came to his own. So his own are the object of the verb being done. Jesus is the nominative. His name isn't stated here, but it's implied. And we know that it's a third person singular verb. So that nominative is implied. He came to his own. So the verb is towards the object, which is his own. And his own did not recognize him. Now this time, his own, we have a definite article hoi, and the word for own is idioi, which we get idiosyncratic and idiotic and words like that from. His own didn't receive him. The verb at the end to receive is paralabon. Now this time, his own have gone into the nominative because they're doing the verb, the receiving bit. And in this case, it's got an adversative before it, not. So the verb is in the negative sense. They are not doing it. They are not receiving it. But in terms of the grammar of the sentence, they are still nominative, doing or not doing the verb. The nominative is the subject of the verb. It doesn't matter whether they're not doing the verb or doing the verb. It is the subject of what is happening. Then in verse 12, it says, "Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God." So let's just bring up the interlinear. Remember, as I said at the beginning, I'm not going to go too much into the Greek. I want you to think about the English and what the grammar means here. So, as many, however, received him, the verb is received, and him is accusative because he is the object of that verb to be received. So the many it's talking about, they're in the nominative, they're doing the receiving, and he, Jesus, is the one being received, that he is the object of the verb. Then edoken is in there. He gave them authority. Teknotheu genesthai. We've got that gen word again from Genesis, to be, to become something. So he's giving them the authority to become children of God. In this case, them has gone into the dative. So underneath the word them, altois, we've got P pro. Bible Hub's little abbreviation there. That's personal pronoun. So there's a pronoun about people. D stands for dative. M stands for masculine, and third person, so we know it's going to be them. So he's given them the authority to become children, tekna, to of God. The to has dropped off in this case. It's already been used in the paragraph. So it's not been used again here. But we know that it's genitive because it's got that omicron epsilon with a circumflex over the epsilon. It's and u genesthai. And the last line, to those, a definite article there, tois, believing in him, believing in the name of him, I should say. So in that last line, the believing is the verb, and the name of God is the object of the verb happening. So name, onoma, has gone into the accusative. And the very last one, the personal pronoun of him, again we've got u, omicron epsilon, which looks like the O and the U, but is omicron epsilon with a circumflex. Again, that's genitive because it's his name. The name belongs to him. Remember, genitive is either possessive or associative. In this case, possessive is his name. It belongs to him. It continues in verse 13. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or of a husband's will, but born of God. So at the start we have not of blood, ex hematone. We get hematology and all sorts of medical words relating to blood come from this one. Hema, in this case hematone, it is a genitive because it's of the blood we are talking about. We might think in modern terms about, children of our genetic makeup or of our blood. Nor of the will of the flesh. So basically that's kind of saying that Jesus has come into the world not because two people wanted to have sex. Basically, I think it's saying, if that's not too crude a point for now, it's not about fleshly desire. And that's sarx or sarkos is often used to talk about flesh in a sinful sense. Not always, but it's often talked of in terms of sex. So when it's talking about the will of the flesh, it's talking about lust and sexual attraction. Then it says, ouda ekthalaematos andros, nor of the will of a man. In this case is often translated as husband, and that's not uncommon in English. We say a man and wife, as in husband and wife. That's a reasonable assumption to make. But it's saying it's not done because of sexual desire. It's not done because of bloodlines. It's not done because a husband wants it to happen. There's no husband involved here because Mary, she marries Joseph later, but she's a virgin. So it's not about sex. It's not about Joseph's bloodline per se, although Joseph is a distant cousin of Mary, so there is some blood relation there. It is about God's will. But of God we are born egenethesan. And that gen word back there that I said about Genesis, the coming into being, here is translated as being born, and it's past tense. So it's egenethesan. But of God they were born, al ektheu egenethesan. John 1:14. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So I've come up to this point because it is one of my absolute favourite bits in the Bible. I was going to end a bit earlier, but I wanted to just include this because it's a really good example of why it's good to learn how to read the Bible in one of its original languages. So the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Kai ho logos sarx ageneto. Again, that word to become, ageneto, yet again used. Kai eiskenosen en hemen. Now some Bibles say he dwelt amongst us. But that word eskenosen, we know it's gained the epsilon at the beginning, the e sound, because it's in the past tense. It comes from skenoo, which is a tent, and in particular it's used to talk about the tabernacle, the dwelling place of God. And this is really interesting because Jesus is God. He became flesh. He is the Word of God becoming flesh. So in the Old Testament, God existed amongst the people by coming into the tabernacle, in the place of meeting, and met with Moses in there. But in the New Testament, he is Emmanuel, God with us. And he has become like that tent by becoming flesh. So some people have translated this as he was tabernacled into a fleshly form, or the Word became flesh and was tabernacled amongst us. Now, tabernacled is not a word, so you can see that actually this is quite a difficult phrase to translate. There isn't a direct, correct English translation, but by knowing a bit of theology, by knowing a bit of Greek, I've been able to work out that really important point that Jesus Christ, the Lord, our God, dwelt amongst us in human form. And so I'm ending there as a really strong reminder of one of the really excellent reasons why it's so powerful and so important to learn the language of the Bible and learn to read it in its original meaning. There's often so much more to get from it than we can just by reading it in English. Now, I've spoken in this video and in others about using Bible Hub. Do check out my video on resources for more information, but here it is in Bible Hub, and we have the Greek word, above it a phonetic pronunciation. I've highlighted the word aiskenosen, the one I was just talking about. Below the Greek word is the translation, below that the parsing. But right at the top we have the strong number, 4637 in this case. And if we look at 4637, we will have that word skenoo, where it gives you the phonetic pronunciation. You'll see that over the E is a horizontal line and over the last O is a horizontal line. That shows us that they are long vowel sounds. So a long E sound becomes usually pronounced A, and a long O sound. So you see transliteration is S-K-E-N-O-O. And then where it says phonetic spelling, it says ske-no-o. And the usage is to dwell in a tent, to encamp. And the word tabernacle, as I said, is there. In the word study bit, you'll find out a bit more information about that word, and you can scroll down from here, and below that you'll find Thayer's Greek lexicon, which will show you about how the word was used in the Septuagint, how it's used in classic texts and near classic, near ancient and ancient texts as well. People like Philo and Plato and Socrates and Homer, and lots of very interesting people that if you've done classical Greek or ancient Greek you will have studied. And it's very interesting to look at some of these words and find out more about them by doing so. And remember, some words are only used once in the New Testament, so if we don't look to other literature we can't find other precedents for how they are translated. And we need precedent for translation. If we only have one example of a word, how do we know how to translate it? We need those other precedents for its translation, and that is why our understanding of Greek has advanced over time. And that's one of the reasons why I'm not a massive fan of the King James Bible, because it actually uses older texts like the Vulgate and Textus Receptus, and we have learnt a lot since then. We've discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we've discovered other texts, we've learnt more about the language, we've got more accurate in our translation. So there's a lot of power and beauty in the King James Bible text, but I would say that for accuracy I would be looking towards something like an ESV, NRSV, RSV, NIV, New American Standard Bible, Holman Bible. They're all very, very good, accurate modern translations that take into account the best of our knowledge. But I mentioned that, and I mentioned the King James because the strongest concordance and the strong numbers were compiled based on King James and the occurrence of words in the King James, and it is a huge work that they did to bring this together. And it is, although I wouldn't say the King James is the most accurate translation, and I'd encourage you to look at more modern versions for accuracy and for your Greek Bible study, that work on the strong numbers and the Strong's exhaustive concordance was huge. I've got them as physical books, and they are big, heavy books, really big. The biggest book I own, I think. And that's a great work, and you can look at it all. It was done quite a long time ago, so it's beyond copyright. It's all available online, and strong numbers are used quite a lot, and there's lots to learn from that. Well, thank you for coming. I have been Tony, and you have probably been, well, you've probably been either confused or bored, but never mind. Keep going. It's, I was overwhelmed at this stage. It seemed like so much. And I was doing it in a time before there was all this technology to help us. So if I can do it, you can do it. And it's much easier nowadays. And you don't need to learn it all to be able to use those resources online, as I've said so many times. So I hope that this video has been useful and interesting for you, though. Do give me feedback on how it works, things like pacing, questions that you have, anything like that. Let this be a two-way process so that I can help you, help me to help you, sort of thing. Click on the subscribe button so you can get a notification about when new videos are uploaded. You also have to work out your notifications, so go into your settings on YouTube, on your YouTube account, and see how it's going to notify you. But set up the subscription to this channel. Doesn't cost anything, and you'll get a reminder each time a video pops up. And I'm gonna, as we go through things, I'm gonna try and remember to keep doing little fairly short explainer videos and some practice videos to go with that, and then also some vocab videos as well. But thanks for joining me, and goodbye and God bless.